I'm quite excited about what's about to come. I'm quite honored by the fact that our Fireside Chat guest of tonight has agreed to join us for a nice and intimate interview. He's founded a software product boutique called Sofa a long time ago that got acquired by Facebook, and then he lived for a couple of years in Silicon Valley and returned to Amsterdam to co-found Framer, which is a next generation interactive design tool. You could call it like that, I guess. And they recently announced a massive Series A funding round, which basically puts them in a position to invent the future of user interface prototyping. So I'm excited to hear his view on the relationship between design and development, Silicon Valley versus Amsterdam, and his approach in general to making things. So I would like to ask you to give a warm round of applause to Koen Bok and to our presenters, Rick and Nick.
Well, welcome, Koen. It's
Thank you very
awesome
much.
that you're here. I think a lot of people in the industry have seen a part of your work and what you do. So I would like to ask you to maybe introduce, how would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I think some people might have seen it, but I can explain a little bit what Framer is. My background is sort of, it is like from my website that's old, but there is some truth to it that I kind of started in graphic design when I was younger. I learned programming in Perl back in the day and got kind of excited when finally Flash made me really, sort of gave me an environment to really play around with programming and graphics together. And from there on, I just kind of got addicted and then started like a startup, but it wasn't really a startup back in the day because I didn't know it was a startup, just a small company building stuff. And it just went on from there. So that's sort of where the mix comes in. I'm really interested in sort of an intersection between design and technology. I really like sort of human-computer interactive stuff, how humans interact with computers, but also really how people express themselves, being it like programmatically or through direct manipulation tools, or not really with dance, but like express themselves, express ideas through technology. I really like that part.
I could totally see that happen. Like the next generation of web developers is going to be a dance API.
I don't think that's really going to catch on.
Yeah. I mean, it'll do wonders for our health,
It would be a lot more fun to look at.
So I'm curious. You mentioned, I guess, Sofa just now as your first adventure into building a company and starting a business.
Yeah.
When you started that, when did you realize? It sounded like you were doing your stuff and it just kind of happened. When did you realize, and what happened where you were like, okay, this is actually a thing? Can you just describe that transition from, hey, I'm just doing what I like, to, oh shit, this is really a real thing here?
Yeah, and I think you described that pretty well. I think the moment that everything I always started with a side project. So basically I was working in a store and I was working with like a retail system and I hated it. And I thought, okay, I can make something better than this. But I had that about like 4 times a week and it almost never led anywhere. And for some reason, this specific thing actually got me to really make a small point of sale system based on Postgres, and it's really fun to make. And from there, I tried to sell it back to the company that I was working for, which was pretty naive, but and it didn't work. And then I found somebody who was just selling their stuff on the internet. So from there on, we're like, well, if we sell 1 copy, we have something that resembles a little company, and we could maybe turn this into something like a profession. It felt way more like a hobby to us.
You're saying we? I mean...
Yeah, so it was funny. This sounds weird, but I was looking for people that would also program, because specifically the kind of stuff that I was building was I was making Mac desktop applications. And so 10 years ago in Amsterdam, nobody was really working on the Mac. It was Objective-C, and it was like kind of old Next Step people that got into web objects, sort of like this weird web framework that Apple got into. But it wasn't the sort of like iOS developer community or anything like the Ruby or the JavaScript community that you have now. So I was really looking for a buddy to help me to kind of, like spar with and build stuff with together. And at the company that I was working at, it was like the Apple store here in Amsterdam, there was one person, and I just felt that he could program. He couldn't, but I knew that he could do it. So
Those are the best.
He stacked the coins in a certain way, and
I
you were
don't know,
like,
some people you just know, like there's, I don't know, you could just tell, like they're intellectual, they get math and all that stuff. So at some point I asked him, hey, you want to help me out? You want to start this software thing with me? And he's like, but I can't program. I'm like, yeah, you can program. And yeah, half a year later, he spent some time on it. He got really, really good. So that was a pretty cool moment. So I kind of like picked somebody that I liked, and we teach each other how to program. I taught him a little bit, and then he taught me a lot after that because he became a lot better than I did. And then it's sort of, when we started selling that first copy, we kind of had a company. And it didn't really feel like a real company. It just felt like another way to make a little bit of money on the side. But slowly, sort of the whole internet thing started to happen, and you see a bunch of people, doing proper startups. And at that point, we were like, shit, this could be like a proper job, right? Like I don't have to learn anything else, which I didn't.
So I'm kind of trying to imagine what happened there and how the two of you were working. So what were your roles, and how did you define who was responsible for what as you were like progressing in your startup?
Yeah, there was just, I guess, how any startup still starts. We kind of have that too now. Like you kind of pick some work that you want to work on based on what's most important to get the project forward according to your goals. And there's also a bunch of intrinsic motivation that comes into play, especially for both programmers and designers. Like if you have a wave that you can catch to work on something that you want to work on, that's way more efficient than, procrastinate. Well, you obviously have some way to turn procrastination into something productive.
yeah, just redefine your procrastination as a company, and it's just worse.
That's another way of looking at it. But so to us, we kind of like try to catch those waves, and I know where we're kind of living, and it starts to define what you're building. So for us, that was like whenever we could show what we built to people and they were working with it, that was the best feeling. So the moment, this was just like the little point of sale system in the beginning. When we saw the first few people use it, yeah, we kind of knew that's gonna get really addictive.
And how did what was your partnership with your business partner like? Was it like, equal for everything, or were you this Mr. CEO man,
Yeah, I don't think really we had titles back then, but the way that we set it up is we were with the three of us, but I did a whole bunch of work in the beginning, and then Dirk joined later on, and then we found somebody else who was a really good icon designer, Jasper. So we both joined with the three, and they basically had half of the company, and I had half of the company. But this is actually a really good tip when you start a company. If you start a company, you do 50-50, you always should give away like a very little percentage to somebody that you both trust. Because 80 to 90% of the companies, they sort of like fail in the first year because the co-founders get into an argument and there's no decision. And no decision means that your company is dead. And both the co-founders also have sort of like the power to kill the company, because if one walks away, then the other one is just left with 50%. So vesting is kind of another trick for this. But if you have somebody that you both trust, you almost never have to use them, because you just don't get in a fight, because then you kind of give your power away to a third person to make the decision for you. So that was a really good trick for us.
And it was an advisor, or there was somebody that was your icon designer?
No, this was some advisor that we had, somebody who was in finance that didn't really know too much about what we're doing, but we both trusted him, so worked. So we never had to use him either.
You used a professional coin flipper.
I guess so, and I guess that also helped, because we were both like, we're never gonna ask him, right? He doesn't even really know what we're doing, so.
That's awesome. So you were talking about sort of catching the waves. Do you remember like a night when you went home and you thought, okay, today was an amazing day and we really, hit the nail on the head? It was just like, okay, we did it. Can you just describe? I'm sure there was a moment like that, and you were like extremely happy, and you thought, okay, this is really happening now. Do you remember such a day?
It's all like it's a whole ocean of waves in that regard. So I think you have waves in the categories that you finally solve this problem that you thought about for a long time, and it could be like a very technical thing that you wanted to solve, but also in our case, it was mostly like a really elegant way to solve a problem for the user. So make something really complex understandable. So I can remember, for example, in this category, like we had to figure out how to deal with two orders at different computers being edited at the same time. So sort of the concurrency in users. And then we kind of relied on the social aspect to solve it rather than the technical aspect. But it took us a while to not do it technically, because that's the tool that you have. So you first try that, right? So you start making sort of like a concurrency thing and locking. And then finally you go like, no, these people should just talk to each other, and that will kind of solve it. And so there's a few of those. I think when I started, I really wanted to win an Apple Design Award, because it's like the nerdy Oscars for interface design. And I once met somebody who had one, and it's like Apple gives out these prizes once a year for the best software, mostly the best looking software, to be honest. And there's one company in Europe that actually won one, and I was there once, and like they're these like really nice little cubes, and I'm like, man, if someday I can have one of those. So that was like a big wave for us. We won one of those at some point, just randomly. I never expected that to happen.
For the point of sale software.
For the point of sale software, which really sounds ridiculous, because nobody was using it except for a few store owners. But Apple liked it so much that they gave us like an Apple Design Award for it. Then the next year we started making a little bit more developer tools. So this was sort of our hit product, and it was Subversion, or it was called Versions, and it was a Subversion API or a Subversion GUI. So Subversion was the sort of de facto versioning system, but the API was pretty hard to use, the command line interface. And by just putting a really nice GUI on top, like a lot of people would start using it, but also graphic design agencies, and like sort of we had the NASA using it, and a bunch of people you wouldn't really expect. And that was the second year, and then again we won an Apple Design Award. So now we feel pretty good about ourselves at this point. We were like, shit, yeah, this is getting really serious.
Yeah, what did that do to your personality?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm saying you kind of like through these waves, and like being a little bit younger and having some of that success, you get kind of cocky and at phases, but it corrects itself really quickly if you surround yourself with the right people. And I think, you know, being Dutch a little bit and having like good grounded Dutch friends helps in that regard too.
Yeah, can you speak a bit more about surrounding yourself with the right people? I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's always, I've been very lucky with that mostly. I've never had, I mean, there have been troubles in the previous company with, you know, you set it up in a way, everything you do for the first time isn't like the best way to set it up, right? So we had a few problems. One specific one, for example, is that if you give everything away, all the shares up front, and you have new really great people that come in, they're never gonna sort of feel appreciated the same as the original founders. Now, another thing that I sometimes found is that original founders tend to maybe become a little bit less excited about the trajectory of the company at some point. So now you have situations where people that work way harder than sort of the original people, but they'll never get as much stock, and that feels weird. So there's all these cool mechanisms around startups that you can kind of learn that can really avoid this. And it seems like venture capital bullshit, and it kind of is a little bit too. But there's good tricks to sort of change the dynamics to get everybody motivated all the time. So I got a little bit more excited about that today than I used to be.
Can you share one of the tricks to have people be motivated?
Well, I think vesting, for example, is like a good one in this, and it gets pretty technical here, but it's about ownership, and the ownership is really much connected to like how invested you are in the company. So vesting is a sort of a typical thing that if you start working for a larger company, you get a bunch of shares, and you don't get like a quarter of the shares after the first year. This is the most typical setup. And then each year after that, you get another quarter. So the longer you stay, the more you're gonna get. But you can also do this for founders. So for example, I have this with my co-founder now. If I didn't like Framer that much and I would quit in the first year, I would still have some shares, but I didn't vest the rest of my shares. And he can continue with the company and give that to somebody else who wants to step up in the company or get a new external co-founder. And that's a good way to protect everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that sounds very, very sensible. And I think it's called reverse vesting or something for founders, or just normal vesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that there's reverse vesting too, but I'm not if that. Oh yeah, it's because you already have it.
You already had it, and you gave
back.
it away, and it's sort of. I think it's called reverse vesting for founders.
Could be.
But anyway,
I think I have that.
so. So
What do you think? Go ahead.
So my question would be like, okay, so you transitioned from Sophie, you have won a bunch of design awards, and then Facebook. Could you?
Yeah, so I'm kind of telling the design awards story because it gives me a bridge to explain how that Facebook thing went. And you got to understand, like the way that I look at this stuff is that it's hard work. Don't get me wrong. Like we put a lot of hours into programming and designing, but it's also like crazy lucky. I mean, who could imagine that like some interface design technical company gets bought by a social network or something to fix design? That's just crazy. So, and most of the things that I experienced in my career that I consider, now maybe the things that the external people consider my biggest successes are mostly luck, honestly. So with this, it's just that we start winning these Apple Design Awards, and the iPhone comes out, and we're really good at interface design at this point. So we create all these little icons that everybody's using. So all the bigger companies start looking at us. We don't have any money though at this point. But
So you made an open source icon pack or something?
No, so we started contributing to open source projects that averagely don't have the best icons, and we started making icons for them. So one that's still being used quite a lot is Transmission for the Mac. So it's a BitTorrent client, and it's like a little gear shift. It's now 10 years old, I think, the icon. And there's a few of those that we made, plus the Apple Design Awards, plus our own software. And now all these larger companies start looking at us and just, looking at our work, sending emails. And we sometimes attend these events. So this specific one was South by Southwest. But we have no money. We have a little bit of money for the tickets and then maybe like $400 for the entire week. So in this specific case, Facebook invited us for dinner. And I remember that the only thing that I can really remember about that dinner is walking into that fancy restaurant and go like, I hope they pay. Because I had no money. It was kind of a weird dinner because like we were now sitting with a bunch of Facebook designers, and normally people always wanted to talk about our work and how we worked and how we got really good at this interface design stuff. But these guys were kind of, it felt different, right? So they were kind of feeling us out a little bit, and then they paid for the whole dinner. So we were like, yeah, this feels awkward.
If they pay for dinner.
Yeah, I mean, but like it was too fancy of a place for me. I'd never been in a restaurant like that. So I was like, whoa. I guess it's like a month or two later, and we suddenly get an email from Mark Zuckerberg. And now I wasn't a big Facebook fan, to be honest, but they just shipped they just had the movie out. So I knew about that. I didn't have a Facebook account. And honestly, my first response is like, I looked around in the company. I'm like, guys, don't fuck with me. It's like, it's like who's joking? But it turned out.
How big was the team at the time?
Maybe 12 people.
Okay.
Yeah, and mostly like 50-50 designers, engineers, and then we had like one person doing support. And we were doing well. So we have 4 products at this point, and they're making a little bit of money, just enough to get by, but like we're not getting rich off it. But we're having a lot of fun. And we can sometimes go to South by Southwest on a budget, which is cool too. So Zuck mails us, and we were like, all right, there's a phone number in here. What do we do? So we call him, and like we're on the phone for like 2 hours with him. He's doing the whole pitch about Facebook, and he's like, well, I like you guys. You guys should probably visit. Why don't you take your best designers and fly out here, and we'll talk further. And we're like, geez, okay. So we go to Menlo Park or Palo Alto, where it's based, and in the airplane, or actually at the airport, we have to make our Facebook accounts, right? Because it looks weird. So we create Facebook accounts, put like profile pictures in and stuff, and so we go there, and in the airport, we're kind of naive at this point still, right? Like I don't really know that we're running a startup. I couldn't even spell the word entrepreneur, and so in the airplane we're talking. So what do you think they want? Right? Like, do you think they want a partnership maybe? Or maybe they want to do a small investment? Or so next day we arrive and we walk up to the desk, and it's still like the old campus that they have, but it's already pretty big, like 2,000 people or something. And we walk to the receptionist, and we're like, hey, we're here from Sofa. And she goes like, oh, you're here for the acquisition. We're like, all right, so that's clear.
Now we know.
So apparently they have those talks like twice a week. So like she was pretty forward about that. And from there on, it's just like, I mean, it's easy to get excited about that, right? You walk around and it's just like you're in Silicon Valley. We've been there a few times, and to be honest, it has some bad sides as well. But like, it's just so exciting, the whole vibe at this office, and everybody's like pretty good that you talk to, and you can see where they're going. And it's this guy from the movie, and like it all helps. So yeah, we just thought, okay, let's see how far we can get with this. And then, so we started negotiating for a week or two. And then after a while, we got all the numbers good and sort of like all the packages for the employees. And we're like, okay, let's do it. Let's go to Silicon Valley. And I'll say one other thing about it, something that I only realized after reflecting back onto my first startup, and I got into this problem with the second startup again a little bit. So it's hard to sometimes take your own advice too. But if people come to me in the Netherlands for like startup advice, then they're always thinking about, should I go after and play the VC game? And I know you have some experience with this too, and it's kind of a hard question because you know you're gonna give ownership away, and you kind of have to learn about fundraising, and fundraising itself isn't really fun. And there's something really good about starting like a boutique business or like something for yourself that makes good money. It's kind of small, but you're serving a bunch of really great clients. But the thing that I realized in hindsight is that I kind of had a company like that. Sofa was doing really well. We were making enough money to get by. At some point we would make like a nice amount of money. You could see that happening in the future. But if you start a startup and you're not really sure that you want to do that, and you take that trajectory, you're going to do it for a very long time. And the delta of change each year is getting smaller and smaller. So the chance that you're getting bored with it is getting bigger and bigger. And a really good reason for us to take venture money, or for anyone to take venture money, is that either the company goes like this or it crashes. And it is this force function of you to change enough about your company each year to still keep it interesting enough, or to crash and stop. And stopping as an entrepreneur is really hard.
Yeah, and then also you have to realize opportunity cost, right? Because the slow decay is opportunity cost of not doing something else.
Yes.
And that opportunity cost can be gigantic, because you have to compare the opportunity cost to what if you had a successful company in the 2 years that you were sort of, not going in the right direction. Well, calculate what you would make in an exit, and that's your opportunity cost.
Yeah, but I think the opportunity costs mostly time, right? Because, for example, if you want to do another startup, it's just easier when you're younger, and time at some point becomes a way more valuable resource than money. And I see way too many entrepreneurs just holding on too long to the same ID that's not really going anywhere. And it's hard to say because some IDs take 5 years of going nowhere before they catch on. So there's always a reason to continue, but it's not really bad to fail. It's great to sort of like gracefully exit one ID and go into the next. Counts for side projects, also counts for companies, as long as you're doing it gracefully.
No, yeah, I agree. The way I see a startup is that you got a shot at testing your idea in the market.
Yeah.
And if that fails, you should do a new one, essentially. That's the way I see it. Like, if your idea execution fails, you can pivot maybe once, but you don't have to like keep.
Yeah. And running out of money is a really good way to force yourself to stop.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is sort of like a really good part about the VC stuff. And a really bad part about an entrepreneur is that you have to be so crazy to start with the ID, so risk averse, that you put so much effort into convincing yourself that it's good, that it's really hard to switching yourself to convincing to stop.
Yeah, no, that's the hardest thing for entrepreneurs for sure. So can you tell me a little bit about how you moved on from Facebook into Framer and how your relationship with VCs in that sense?
Yeah. So starting Framer was just a side project at Facebook, honestly. At Facebook, I had the option to become an individual contributor or a manager. And this is cool about these larger companies. Facebook, for example, makes sure that they pay individual contributors the same amount as managers, because mostly what happens in large companies is that if you are a really good engineer, you can make up to a certain amount of money. But then the only way to make more money is becoming a manager. So all your best engineers end up being managers, and some of them are really shit. But then they're never going to switch back to becoming an engineer again, and you lose them forever. So companies like Facebook and Apple and Google, they have these 2 individual tracks. So you can either be an individual contributor or a manager, and you can kind of jump around to see what you like better, which is a really good way of approaching it. Now, after running a company for 5-6 years, I was kind of done with managing, so I became an individual contributor. And I was a product designer, and the first project that I did was the first version of Facebook Mobile Messenger. That was a small project back in the day. It's now pretty big. And my work was basically working with, well, Mark was very involved with all these decisions. So he's like pretty big into product. So basically he would give us an assignment. So solve this specific problem or make me a proposal for a mobile messaging app. We would go off with like a small product design team, and then I would be in the room with him, and I would present sort of how he would do it with like all these other people in the room that are like directors and like not makers, more and more once the company grew bigger and bigger. And we would present it, and the way that we would present this interactive work would be, there's like a beamer at the end of like a screen at the end of the table, and I would have Photoshop open, and I would have a bunch of mocks, and I would go, well, Mark, if the user logs in, they see this, and then if when they click that button, wait for it, and I switch to a different image, I go like, well, then they see this, and the whole room goes like, uh-huh. But that they have to kind of figure out what happens in between, right? And the longer I'm at Facebook, the better the devices start to get. So suddenly we have like really nice performance on iOS. So people start playing with friction and with like sort of physics. And these things you just can't express in Photoshop. So really quickly for us, it became sort of a nice thing to start playing around with a better way to express these IDs. Like what you want to have is really good prototyping for cheap. Because what you can do then instead is just hand over your phone, and then people can judge an ID not just by how it looks, but by how it feels. And how an app feels is getting really important if the devices can deliver these super immersive experiences. So going back to sort of the first company, I really like building tools, and I always loved Adobe as a company because they were making these super cool creative tools that I used to, I learned basically being a designer in Photoshop, so that's pretty close to my heart. But I also wanted my own Adobe. So the moment that we kind of saw that, I was looking at Jorn, who was at my previous company, and he was with me at Facebook, and we kind of were talking about maybe co-founding the next company together, and we're like, shit, this could be like a way to build our own creative tools company, because Adobe's not really seeing this. And that led to the decision to quit Facebook and start a new startup.
And how is the timeline as opposed to the rest of the market? Because there's a whole boom of rapid prototyping tools in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so
that was before?
Yeah, it's all before that, which is crazy because like most of the the interactive tools that you see now are like less than 3 years old. And we started with the origination of the Framer ID was about like 3.5 years old. So the only one that I think is as old is Origami, which is based on Quartz Composer. And Quartz Composer was this weird sort of demo app for Apple to do visual programming and then to sort of do demos on the GPU. And it was so cool that people would use it for prototyping. And basically half of the first iPhone was prototyped with Quartz Composer hooked up to a bunch of G5 Macs. And so that was the other like really old sort of flexible app that everybody was using, but Apple wasn't really keeping it up, so it sort of died off a little bit.
So I want to go back to the moment where you were presenting the first version of Messenger in front of this room. How did you know that you're doing the right thing? Was it just like you got feeling, you think this is the direction we need to head, or did you have like a plan? Like how did you?
I mean, you mean for the app itself?
Yeah, like I'm kind of thinking you're sitting there in a room. There's a bunch of really important people, and you need to be really convinced about that what you think is right is actually right. And so how did you get a sense for this is the path forward, and this is the right direction?
Yeah, that's just confidence after doing something for 5 or 6 years. At that point, I've been building
and 2 Apple Awards.
I mean, that provides some confidence as well. No, but like I was a product designer at that point for 5 or 6 years, so I was still afraid a little bit. I'm always a little bit. You're always a little bit afraid if you're taking the right approach, like internally for yourself, because you're not entirely sure. It's just being a good product designer means that I've done it now for maybe like 15 years, and I still know that if I go into user testing, I'm wrong half of the times. That's just the fact of being a product designer, because you have to predict human psychology with a million variables around that, and it's just undoable. Like it's not like programming where you have like full control over everything, all the inputs and the outputs.
Are you talking about web programming or?
Maybe it's like web programming. No.
So where do you get your inspiration? I'm sure like that's so you're collecting input somehow from somewhere to paint your picture.
Yeah,
What
I think
inspires you?
yeah, you surround yourself with people that kind of like share your ideas, but not enough to like get into this excessive sameness thing, right? But you find a few people where you can bounce around ideas without having to explain the full thing. So if you work for long enough with people or you have a good click, you may mostly need 1 or 2 sentences, and they're like, yeah, I get what you're saying. And then you can really quickly like iterate through ideas and validate them sort of as a first pass. And from there, you just hype yourself up and convince yourself that you can convince the rest of the world to build this thing.
And in terms of your original team, like the sofa team, was that ripped apart and everybody spread around, or did you keep your people?
No, actually, their strategy, and we talked a lot about this in hindsight. Their strategy was they felt like some of their teams didn't have enough talent, and they just saw us as sort of like a talent tree. So they plucked us off one by one and just inserted them in different teams. And I don't think that was a really good idea, because if you build that thing up where you can go really quickly together, like it's just a shame to not use that. And I'm not saying that like if you ever bring a team on or you combine 2 teams together that you should keep them all together, but at least pair them up, or like pair a good designer and an engineer up, or 2 engineers that are very sort of complementary. I would always do that.
All right, so let's move forward a little bit then to the starting of Framer. Okay, you saw an opportunity, like prototyping tools, but what made you choose this particular way of doing things?
So I think the biggest reason is that you need to have sort of an ID to where you know that people need something, right? Like people need to buy something. You need to validate that first. And the way that we did it is that at Facebook, I was already playing with a small JavaScript framework to do prototyping. But that meant that you had to set up like auto refresh for the browser. You need a browser and sort of a Photoshop importer thingy that I wrote, and your text editor. And that's not a really, still JavaScript kind of has this problem a little bit, that the setup costs really sort of like sometimes make you not work on something, because you're like, shit, no, I don't feel like starting a new project. I'll work on the older thing. So it was a cool thing to play around with, but the first thing that we thought we'd start with is, why don't we, close the feedback loop for designers? So why don't we make sure that designers have direct feedback when they start typing JavaScript, and they see what's happening on the phone? So kind of the auto refresh a little bit. And the second one is we wrap it all up in a nice Mac desktop app. So you can just like, I have an ID, new document, and go. And we kind of started there. So I programmed that in maybe like a month or month and a half. And we just put it out there, and it just took off. So all our old friends at Facebook started using it. Some of these people now moved on to Google or some of the other companies, so they introduced it there. So we had this really cool, maybe like 100, 200 user base from the beginning. But they're all designers that are making, products for these large companies. So you see all this cool work sort of coming out of it. And at that point, we felt, oh shit, we're onto something.
And in this context, who's we?
Me and Jorn. So Jorn is the first employee that I had at the previous company, but he wasn't my co-founder. And then at Facebook, he was also working with me, but we're both
the icon designer,
designers.
right?
Huh?
The icon designer.
Yeah, he's an icon designer. He's a really good product designer. So he's also really good at like thinking through how products should work.
And how was your experience dealing with code fear? Like a lot of designers have like, this is code, and then they'll just mentally block it as not their thing.
Funny. I thought you meant something else. Because like one of the things that I deal with as code fear is like not daring to publish my code, because I feel like people like you might read it and go like, this guy is bad. I can't believe it. So that's another thing, but you deal with that by just uploading it and just chill out. And then mostly is all right. Code fear is basically the thing that's still holding us back. So the idea that all Framer is based on, or a large part of Framer, is that direct manipulation, so the canvas that you have in Photoshop, is a great way to express yourself if everything is static. Basically, you could call it like declarative without any logic. So if you want to draw a circle and have a bunch of stuff and hierarchy, you can express that really well in Photoshop or programs like Photoshop. But if you mix in time and you want to do like interactivity and animation, now you can't really use the canvas for that anymore. And this is the thing that most designers still have to get over. And that's why they like making images so much, because they know that like beyond just images, they need to learn something that's an order of magnitude more complex. Now, if you look at all the ways to express interactivity and logic, you have a lot of ways. You can do it through a GUI, you can do it through visual programming, you can do it through code. And there's probably a lot more ways that I don't really know about to do it. But we had a way, programming, that's been working for 30 or 40 years, and it's very expressive and powerful. So my idea was like, all right, we're just going to teach all the designers to learn how to code. Now, that turned out to be a little bit harder than I thought. But it is really cool to see if it works.
You know, maybe sometimes we could also just wait for a new generation of designers, you know?
Well, this is happening, right? Like the way that designers, like designers of my age, define design versus programmers is very different than a 20-year-old. They don't really think about design and engineering in that way. They just want to make stuff. And that's a combination of, you know, Sketch, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then you can build something.
So are you noticing many young people being more open to this approach?
Yeah, I would say that our audience is mostly skewed towards young people. They seem to also have like an easier time picking it up, and they probably have more time to learn as well. So I definitely feel that if we would have started Framer 5 years later, the adoption rate would be a lot higher even, which is cool. But at least we're like, you're like timing is one of the hardest things with IDs, so I knew we probably wouldn't get that right.
Yeah, they say in Silicon Valley, I think they say that being too early is just as bad as being wrong.
Yeah, I guess we have a little of that. But that's not bad because you can pivot.
Or just wait it out until you're right.
Yeah, sit on it. No. So we had a few approaches there that are kind of interesting. So we played a lot around with trying to make code easier to learn. So we came up with, did anybody here use Dreamweaver back in the day, maybe? Ah, cool. So you know what I'm talking about. So I thought about Dreamweaver, and one of the cool things there is you can learn how to code, well, it's HTML, but by doing direct manipulation, right? So, and then it had this really unintended feature where the HTML that it would write was so bad that you would want to learn how to code. Now, that's the part that we didn't really replicate. But we did replicate, we now parse the code, and we build an AST, and we let you sort of program with a properties panel. And so you can insert a new layer, it will write the code for you. We recognize the layer, you can click a thing, and then a properties panel pops in, and we call it autocode. You can actually manipulate the stuff on the canvas, and it will update the code. And that definitely helped. So we saw adoption grow, but it needed to grow in order of magnitude. And instead it grew by like 20% or something. And we also saw that once people knew how to program, they didn't really use it anymore. It was a really cool demo feature.
Did you figure out why?
Yeah, it's hard to really answer that. I think it's just faster at some point if you are able to go to just not take your hand off the keyboard. And that's also why programs like Vim and Emacs are still so popular, I think. It's my best guess. But it doesn't really matter because like we can still retain code as a really good way to express these things and stay very flexible. But the other idea that we had from the beginning is that the way that we use both code and direct manipulation, or direct manipulation and programmatic manipulation, could probably blend it in some better way to express IDs. I even feel that if I'm writing a React component and I'm typing up, you know, some HTML structure in the GSX, like in the render function, I'm like, yeah, I should probably just draw this, right? Or if I'm typing up CSS, like, why am I not just like visually doing this on a canvas? So that's a really interesting approach where if you could mix direct manipulation with programmatic manipulation in a little bit more blended way, I think that could be very powerful.
I think the word is projectional editing.
Well, that's what we need to build then.
Yes, can you speak a bit more about like where do you see this space move in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah.
Just paint a picture of where you see us, how you see us work.
Yeah, I'll start with like how we are selling our company to both investors, but also to designers, sort of the metaphors that we pick. So in our space, if you look at design tools, and who here is like a Photoshop or a Sketch user sometimes? All right. Oh, okay. That's easy. So, and we're all programmers, right? Yes. Okay, I assume. So we know both these models and how powerful they can be. Now, if you think about, if you want to capture the designer market today, and you think how Sketch did that, which is also a Dutch product, by the way, which is crazy, they just made a better version of Photoshop, right? They looked at, okay, Photoshop is a photo editing tool that's being used for interface design, so why don't we take all the interface design features, innovate on that, and outcompete them? And it took them 8 years, but they did just that, and now they kind of won. So now we have a few different tools, which one of them is funny. It's again an Adobe app, and they're trying to outcompete their Photoshop now. It's called Adobe XD. You have Figma, which is another one that's really cool, and there's a few other ones. But if you think about them, they're all still better versions of Photoshop. And we don't really think that the future of design tools is going to look like a better version of Photoshop. I more look at game tools. So if I look at Unity, what you see is sort of like a platform where you can express yourself with specific editors for a level or on a canvas. But you also have programming that you can mix in. You can put it all together. You can build a component around it. You can share that component. And I think a platform like that, sort of, I would say an IDE for design, would probably be the future of design tools. But it's something that we can't really copy from somebody, so we have to innovate that. And one of the biggest, most powerful parts of it, but also the hardest, is do this blend between direct manipulation and programmatic manipulation.
And in terms of, are you going to go all the way to app building, or do you see prototyping as a field that just stops somewhere?
No, I think I want to go all the way to prototyping, but I haven't had a good idea for it yet. So typically, a few of our competitors, what they try to do is they sell their product as like a prototyping tool that lets you build production code. And what they do is they build a cross-platform runtime. Sometimes they use their own little language on top. They build like an animation toolkit on top. And then they build a whole suite of widgets. And then they have all that. And then they walk into Facebook and they go like, hey, you guys want to use our widgets and our our runtime and our animation toolkit instead of whatever's native on the platform or whatever you guys have yourself. That's never going to work. Plus, you would have to raise like, I don't know, $20 million to do it well. And mostly sort of cross-platform toolkits never give you the best interface experience. They always give you like a decent experience for cheap. So that's not really where we want to be. Like for those reasons, I didn't want to do that. But there's some really interesting parts about we prototype in JavaScript, and we now also do all the production code in JavaScript. So reusing at least parts of that should be very possible. And I think approaches like React Native that have a little bit of a different balance where, you know, you still kind of program in JavaScript and the widgets that you use are kind of native, and you can expand on them by like making a widget on each platform still native and then sort of instruct them from JavaScript. I think that's probably a really cool model to play around with.
So I want to switch gears to Amsterdam. So you were in the Silicon Valley, and then you decided to start a new company here in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, it's multiple reasons. So one, most of your visa is tied to your job. So the moment that you quit, you have to leave the country within 1 day, which is fun.
That happened to you?
That happened to me. There's other ways to get a visa. It's not it's hard, but there's ways to get it. So we kind of like thought a little bit about, you know, should we go back and shouldn't we? And then you get into like a mix of things. So of course, like family and stuff, that's one thing. But also, I like Europe a little bit more, just in terms of living, because one thing that I felt really much, and this is just for Silicon Valley, to be honest, but I always wanted to live in a place where everybody around me would understand my job or what I did. And in Amsterdam growing up, that was always pretty tough, right? It's like, I'm not even talking about that people don't want to talk to you at parties if you start talking about what you really like, but just like generally people understanding what you do or what excites you.
We have Twitter now to do that, right?
It's solved. No, but it's great. Like these days, it's very different, right? There's many people that are like excited about these same ideas. So, but back then it was a lot harder. So I always dreamt of going to a place where everybody would get that. But once I was in it, it felt like there was no escape. So literally, I'm sitting in Dolores Park, and there's like two grandmothers in front of me, and they're discussing the Facebook IPO and what kind of technology they're using. And you're like, this is driving me crazy, because like for me it works a little bit if I hear sort of if I get caught around the same subjects over and over, I just don't really get new ideas anymore. And I think that's probably the downside of Silicon Valley. It's really hard to escape that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've gone to Silicon Valley as well, and there was this first like, oh, everybody understands what we do. What the hell? And then there's like sort of an emergence of a semi-monoculture as well.
Yeah, for sure.
But there's also really, really inspiring people there. I mean, one of the most inspiring ones for me was Brett Victor. And you know, his talk, like design on principle, like first principles. And I wanted to ask you, like, what are your first principles?
Yeah, and I thought about that, and I don't have such a good answer as he has. He's one of these sort of super explorative designers that's sort of like thinking about 10 steps ahead in the future and without any constraints. And all his ideas come from Xerox PARC, basically. So he's basically kind of pissed off that all the cool stuff that they invented there, that we ended up with very different ideas that are much worse in his opinion. So, for example, the small talk paper, just that thing by itself, you can give 10 presentations about that, and everybody here would be, now that's a great idea. I wish we thought of that sooner. But it's from the 70s, right? So this is his whole spiel, and he's amazing at explaining that and sort of reiterating like how good that stuff is.
His research is also very, very detailed.
Yeah.
If you see the way he explores ideas, it's very detailed. But I like the first principles, because I thought about it as well. Like, okay, what are your first principles then?
Yeah.
That's actually a very tough question.
Yeah, and I like the one from Elon Musk too, where he goes like all the way to the basics. So he asks like, all right, but why? So he sort of like tries to figure out the fundamental numbers behind everything, and then like tries to make business assumptions on that. And so the thing that I think it's more about ideas and creativity that I'm more interested in. And for that, I was thinking I can kind of give the same answer as I do to designers. So often people ask like, what makes a designer great? And the thing that I see what the best designers have is they can be very entrenched in a project for weeks and weeks, and they can sit down and within 10 seconds they can, you know, take 20 centimeters of distance from their screen, and they can force a first view perspective on themselves. So they can experience their design that they worked on for weeks as if they saw it for the first time. And that is really, really hard. So
Wow, that's pretty selective amnesia. That's
well, I mean,
can you learn that stuff?
well, no, but you can drink. So there might be like some of those tricks for it too, but like all the best designers that I've seen were able to do that. And I think in a way I don't have that. I can't force myself that. Well, maybe also because programming is a little bit more complex in that way that's a little bit harder to do. But I do try it, and the way that I do it is I explain my problems to others. So the rubber ducky mentality, that's one of my tricks. And if I don't get something, or I feel like I'm kind of stuck in an idea, I just explain it to people that might not even have the solution, but just like through analyzing through it, I can kind of force that perspective upon to myself. So it's not the first principle, it's more of like a trick, but it's a really important trick to kind of stay creative and force yourself out of these sort of loops that you stay in, these local maximum that you get stuck in if you're working on a problem. And I think that applies to technology as well.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we have time for some questions from the audience. This one's working again now.
Does anyone have a question for Koen?
Question. Can ask me anything, startups, technology, whatever.
It doesn't work anymore.
That's okay.
Have you seen
Hello? This one works.
We have one question here.
Yeah. Test 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
I need to switch batteries before the show, man.
So you mentioned these problems with engineers. Like really good engineers tend to be managers because like that's the normal thinking of corporate mentality. And also there's like a limit of like how much money you can make as an engineer.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to a good engineer who sucks at managing but who wants to make a lot of money?
Well, that's a very clear, specific question.
Yeah, no, I think you can more easily every day find a company that respects that and that allows for that. So I think all the great companies are doing it already. I think a lot of startups are copying it. So if your company doesn't allow for that, I would not leave immediately. I would just first maybe propose to them that those tracks would be equal. And then if they don't, then I think there's many really great places for you to work as an engineer and make as much as a manager. I've seen engineers at Facebook make over $1 million a year, which is way more than like a level 7 product manager would make, or like even a director. So it's pretty common now in Silicon Valley, to be honest. So I would try to sort of fix your company first, and if it can't be fixed, then you exit.
Yeah, so I'll try it again.
Or come work with us. We're looking for good people.
Yeah, so the Silicon Valley companies that have 2 tracks is a big thing, right? Like as a developer, you're allowed to be a really great developer. You don't have to become a manager. So if you're a good developer, it's a really good strategy to just become a better developer and keep at it until you figure out what you want to do with being a great developer, because those are, I think, more rare than good managers.
I think there is, in the ladder you have also tech lead and then solution architect and maybe something else, manager of solution architects, it still works. But my question was, you mentioned about the mix of programming and graphical tools for prototyping, designing, doesn't matter. What do you think about React Sketch from Airbnb?
Yeah, that's an interesting explorative thing, and it's very marketable because itself is fun, but I think people overestimate what it is, really. So if you mention React and Sketch in one sentence, a lot of people on the internet tend to go crazy. So there's something there that people want, they just don't know exactly what. So to explain, somebody built a React renderer in Sketch. So basically what you can do is you can define a React component with a subset of CSS, and then you can render it in Sketch, and then it's there. And then you can't really do anything else with it. So it's interesting if you, for example, want to build a design system where you retain like all the original design in code, and now you can, so you don't have to do that in Sketch symbols or anything. But I wonder how useful it is. So one of the interesting things that we're exploring is that if you draw a React component on a canvas, it should probably be the same React component as you use in production. And if there would only be a canvas or like a graphical tool built in React, then you could do that. Now we have that, like our graphical editor is completely built in React. So this is sort of our plan for the next steps is next to a text layer, a bitmap layer, or like, you know, an artboard, you could also have a React layer that could render any React component, and they could contain other React components that you also draw in the editor. And now it gets pretty interesting because you really open up a way to sort of draw with components that you also use in production, which kind of closes the loop a little bit more between prototyping and production. So that's sort of the next step that we'll take with Framer.
Anyone else? Over there.
Hi. Yeah, really
Hi.
cool story about Framer. I have more of a business question.
Go ahead.
So you guys raised Series A, 8 million. What's your biggest challenge right now to grow, or or what's the most difficult challenge that you have right now?
Finding people and finding a new office.
The office is difficult. Right?
Most problems, like it seems like if you get money that you'd never have those problems, but it turns out that you only have those problems when you have money, because you have to spend it, right? Like you have to turn that money into growth for the product, but you also really want to be picky for the people that you want to work with. Like they need to be good and really enthusiastic about the kind of tools that we're working on. Now for us, I think we have a bunch of really great properties to find engineers, because if you're interested in, and now I'm going on this hiring thing, but if you're interested in like graphics technologies, text editors, languages, parsers, all that stuff, we're a really good place to work. So it's a nice problem set. But then even still, it's not that you can just like snip your fingers and there's just 10 great people showing up. So honestly, that is one of the hardest things. Also because my work starts to become a lot more hiring and interviewing. I think longer term, it's picking strategies, right? So if you're at a Series A point, then you have a few really clear things. You kind of have to triple your revenue each year, preferably more. So you have like pretty clear assignments, but you probably have 100 ideas on how to do that. And picking the right one and putting enough sort of resources behind that one and not behind something else, that's probably the toughest decisions. You have a few chances though, especially if you raised a good Series A, then you can mess up 2 or 3 times, but not much more than that. So the pressure's on.
Thanks. Anyone else? Ooh, now they're coming. I'm going to the back first.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm a designer, and I had a chance to look at the framer, and my question is, so what's the reason, me as a designer, to invest my time to learn framer instead of for instance, React? So
Yeah.
So I can use React, and it would be kind of production code. It can be used, but in a framer, when I had a look, I had to code in a JavaScript.
But I can summarize the question, I think. Yeah, so why would you invest time learning Framer if you could invest time in learning React as a designer? And that's a pretty honest question. And I think Framer and React will get a lot closer in the near future. But honestly, I don't think you're learning either Framer or React. I think you're learning JavaScript. So that's kind of the same for the two. And I would definitely learn JavaScript as a designer because it's like the most transferable skill on the internet, and it will change your career, like guaranteed. And whether you do it through Framer and then go into React over time, or you start with React, but for some use cases you use Framer because it's just so easy to get started and get up and running, or you get like the direct feedback, that doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of choice. But learn JavaScript, that's my tip.
Great. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions in the front here. Yeah.
Yeah, you can shout.
Yeah, so you mentioned that at some point it's not money, but it's time that you have a shortage of. I'm always very interested to hear then, if you had more time, what would you be putting it into?
The same.
So your startup.
Yeah, my startup. I mean, I really picked this. So the luxury that you have. So after Facebook, when I quit, for the first time in my career, I could spend a little time thinking about what I wanted to do. And before that, you have a startup, you can't really do that. And then you get acquired, so you can't really do that. So now I gave myself a couple of months to sort of think about it. I got to 6 weeks before I started working again, ultimately. But in those 6 weeks, I was just thinking, okay, what's the single most important thing to pick your next startup for, apart from your co-founder? But because that is a really, really important thing if you decide to do it with a co-founder. But it's picking a problem with properties that you want to work on for a long time. And so, for example, I learned that with the point of sale system. It's a lot of fun if you visit a little store in Soho, but it's a lot less fun to implement all US tax regulations. And we've all done similar stuff. Like it's going to be part of that problem for a long time. Of course, you can like shove them to somebody else. But if you really want to do something for a long time because you like it so much, then you're going to win, because that's a really great weapon. Because a lot of people do something with a horizon of 1 or 2 years, and they're never going to be as good at it as you just plan for it to do it for a really long time. So I think that is the most important thing, that, you know, when you think about it, like, make sure, if you have the luxury, make sure that you pick a problem with the properties that you really, really like working on. For a tool, obviously, the best property is people make things with it. So you see the work, and that's the best thing for me. Great side effect, people learning JavaScript is also very fulfilling. And those 2 things are enough to make it, for me, the best problem to work on.
Let's move on to the last question in the back. It's your honor.
Thank you. Thank you for such a inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Recently, I read a opinion from another young, very successful entrepreneur over the internet. He advised all the young people to drop their work on corporate and enterprise because he say that working on enterprise really kills your talents. And so advise all the guys to start hacking around before they find what they really want and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your thought? How long you might hacking around before you need to start thinking about your financial stability?
Yeah. I don't have like a super cool personal story about that because I just rolled into something and I stuck with it and it ended up well, so I really like it now. But you know, I read the Paul Graham stories, for example, and I know that he really thinks that you need to take some time in between to discover what you like. And I think creatively, like in the beginning of your career, you're just a little bit more open-minded and you have more time to explore these concepts. Although I also still feel that the cliche of becoming older and wanting to stop learning didn't really apply to me yet, so I can't really speak to that side. But, you know, I guess I'm probably never gonna get in a fight with somebody for advising that you need to explore early on in life with many different things. So yeah, that would probably be a good idea. I think enterprises, honestly, are also a pretty good experience, probably even also early on in your career, as long as you don't get stuck. Like I have friends that used to be really good, now they're and they know who they are, so I'm not sure if this is gonna record it, but you're stuck for 5 years at Facebook, leave that place, man, and learn something new, right? It's if you get into like, if you stick at one place, and they'll always tell you, it's different every day, right? Like new people, and it's kind of true, but you know, you're in a certain environment and the tasks that are at hand are very business driven most of the time. So the hard part is that these companies pay you so much that it gets pretty hard to leave, because I've seen a lot of very talented people start tying sort of their self-worth to the amount that they see come in every month. And that's where it gets really scary, because they seem to be in a phase where they used to do something really for fun and really enjoy it, and now they kind of start doing it for the money a little bit. And if that would happen to me, to my work, I would lose something very precious in my life, because it's the thing that I enjoy most doing, and I don't want to start losing that. I don't want to not like doing it anymore. So that's my best advice for enterprises. I don't really care about like if you should do it when you're young or old, but if you do it, don't get stuck there.
Thank you for that answer. I think it's time to wrap it up for tonight. It's I think we've got some delay, but for good reason. I thought it was very inspiring. Maybe Nick and Rick, our sweet interview duo, can you want to wrap it up for tonight, or shall I do that?
Yeah, I'm a bit bummed out by the microphone.
This one works.
That one works.
This one works? Oh, it works.
Okay. Well,
I think this was a really, really nice conversation. Thanks a lot for sharing your experiences and your insights. I hope you all also got something out of it. I certainly did, and I think everybody else probably did as well. So I think we should all give a hand of applause.
yeah.
Thanks
awesome.
a lot.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I think the bar is open, so let's all share stories. I think everybody here, we can also ask questions for the talks, because there wasn't any time. I think the speakers are still around, so ask them what you would have asked them. And yeah, I hope to see you guys. Well, Tim, when is the next one?
In March.
In March. So, see you all in March.
That's it.
And thanks for coming.
Thank you.